This is the Bread and Butter Shogun and one of the most unique paddles that I've played with so far. It has a very soft feel to it, but at the same time, it's also very hard. It's a thicker 16mm paddle, but it can also smack the crap out of the ball. Like I said, this paddle is just so unique and really unlike any other paddle that I've used so far, so you're going to want to stick around for this one. With that said, please consider subscribing if any of this is helpful, and let's jump into this thing. All right, to start off, this is an $190 16mm thermoformed paddle with a carbon fiber and titanium weave face. It's one of the few paddles out there right now that is utilizing this new titanium mix concept, which in theory helps the paddle hit a lot harder. And spoilers, it does. The base weight of this paddle sits around 8.0 to 8.3 ounces, though I personally felt that it feels a bit more on the heavier side. That said, the swing weight sits at 120 and the twist weight is 6.18, so stats wise, it's honestly pretty normal, though it is something to note. Additionally, the grip length is also fairly standard at 5.5 inches. Anyways, here are some of the other specs, and now let's jump into the gameplay. Now, typically I jump straight into power like with most of my reviews, but for this one, I wanted to make a quick few notes about the feel of this paddle before I jumped into the specific categories, just because it is so unique. To start, even though this paddle is still carbon fiber, it definitely doesn't have that hard, stiff feel to it. Instead, it actually feels pretty soft, which is, I'm guessing, due to the titanium weave. That said, it also doesn't feel soft as a full-on control paddle like a Vatic or Rhombus either. It doesn't have that same full-on pillow-like feel to it like some of those paddles do. So the Shogun's kind of somewhere in the middle. Now, with all that said, let's finally move on to powered, because even though this thing feels soft, this thing can hit ridiculously hard. This is probably one of the most underrated powerful paddles out there, and it honestly kind of even messes with your mind a bit too, because I think when you initially pick it up or even just look at it, it looks more control oriented, especially since it is a 16mm, but don't let that fool you. Like, I don't want to say it's one of the top hardest hitting paddles out there, because I do think it's a step below that, but sometimes when using this, I feel like I can just drive through some of my points. I mean, drive specifically felt really good with this, and not only that, they also felt really freaking smooth too. One could say the drives almost felt buttery. Get it? Because bread and butter. Never mind. But seriously, this thing can kind of smack sometimes. Things like overheads and surfs also felt great too, and I think a lot of the credit for the unexpected power goes to that titanium weave surface. I mean, the thing is, even when you're hitting hard with it, it feels like you shouldn't be able to with a paddle that soft, but you are, and it's kind of a trippy feeling. But anyways, for power alone, I would give it a solid 8 out of 10. All right, moving on to pop. So honestly, the pop on this isn't bad either, which is really weird, especially on a 16mm elongated shaped paddle, because in general, it's just difficult to keep pop in something this thick and long. But I'm telling you, this paddle somehow manages to do it, and for that, I think I have to once again give credit to the titanium weave surface, because I really have no other explanation for it. It's still a really weird feeling, but the ball does fly off this paddle pretty well, especially in volleys and in hand battles. So overall for pop, I would give it a 7.5 out of 10. All right, on to control. So overall control on this paddle felt a little weird, especially at the start. I'm not gonna lie, when I first picked up this paddle and started using it, I couldn't hit a drop to save my life. Maybe it was just me, maybe I just sucked those days, I probably did, but either way, I just felt like my entire control game was extremely inconsistent when using it. It just felt really not good. That said, I'm really glad that I took longer than usual to get a feel for this paddle, because after a few weeks of continuing to play with it, this paddle did get a lot easier to use. After a few solid sessions, I was eventually able to start getting used to it, and I could finally start hitting drops again. Dinks were never terrible with it, but those definitely got easier over time as well. And the weird thing is, like I said earlier, this paddle is actually fairly soft. Again, it's not extremely soft, but it's soft enough that you'd think the control game was actually pretty good. But even with that, it definitely has a break-in period to it. I also think a part of it is that this paddle just warmed up a little bit over time, making it easier to use too, but still, after you get a feel for it, it's really not too bad for control. So overall, I would give it a 6.5 out of 10. All right, now on to spin. So the spin on the Shogun isn't terrible. It's probably slightly above average, but I'd also say it's definitely not the main highlight of this paddle. You can definitely still generate enough to keep the ball down and arc the ball for things like drives and hybrid shots, but it's also really nothing too fancy. So for spin, I would give this a 7 out of 10. Now the sweet spot, on the other hand, is actually really good. The paddle is actually very forgiving when it comes to where you hit the ball on the paddle, and there have really only been a few times where I've hit a significant dead spot on it and the ball died. But overall, especially for being an elongated paddle, the sweet spot is pretty solid. So for sweet spot, I would give it a 7.5 out of 10. All right, anyways, on to my final thoughts with this paddle. So to start, I want to talk about one of the smaller potential cons of this paddle, and that would be the handle, as as it's a bit more on the square shaped side. Some people like it and some people hate it, and it's really not as bad as some of the other square shaped handles out there, like some of the paddle techs for instance, but it is noticeable, so I think it's worth mentioning. Other than that though, there aren't really too many cons. In fact, on the flip side, I actually have to say this is probably one of the more well-built paddles that I've played with. There's just something about it that feels high quality and sturdy, like you're actually getting your money's worth, unlike some paddles that have been released this year, like the Gen 3s. And to speak of this as a whole, Bread and Butter just seems like a great small company too, as they do a really good job in adding a fun side of things to a competitive paddle. For example, the Shogun, like most of their paddles, all have themes to them, and even the boxing it came with was some of the coolest boxing that I've seen for any paddle company. I mean, they even have custom sauces for each of their paddles. It's pretty cool. Anyways, gameplay wise, this is honestly a really fun paddle, but like I said, the Shogun will probably take some time to get used to. It's just different, and I honestly still don't know how to fully explain how it feels to use it. I had a lot of my friends try it out as well, and they all had similar things to say about it too, but basically the consensus is that it's hard but soft at the same time. It honestly feels like hitting with a Kevlar face paddle on steroids, in the sense that when you hit the ball, it actually feels like you're hitting with a Kevlar paddle when you make contact, but instead the ball still springs off the paddle really hard like you're using a carbon fiber paddle. So yeah, admittedly not the best explanation, but that's about the closest I got. Still, I honestly think a lot of people will really enjoy this paddle, especially if you're looking for a softer, hard-hitting paddle, because again, you can really drive the ball with this thing. That said, I have to admit that this paddle is so unique that I think this paddle is one of those things that you're either going to fall in love with or you're just not going to like it all. And I'm not sure how much room in between there is with this one. Still, if you are interested in it, I would definitely give it a shot, as they do have a 30-day full return policy. And even after that ends, they still have a 6-month warranty, which is great. Also, feel free to use my code to get a bit of a discount as well if you want. But anyways, hopefully this was helpful. If it was, please consider subscribing. And with that, I will see you next time. Peace.